Welcome, everybody, to LA Times. We thank you for stopping in and spending a few minutes with us. Please hit that subscribe button and please hit that like button. It tells YouTube that people are watching, and YouTube will in turn share with others that we are live and on. Today, we are talking with John Silva. He was a correctional officer at DVI Tracy, also known as Gladiator School, at the same time I was there. And I could verify that John is a very well respected person. He was well respected by the staff as well as the inmates. During this interview, we will hit topics such as Crips and Bloods, North, South, different things that were happening on the Tracy at the time he worked there or at the time I was an inmate. No disrespect is intended towards anyone. We're just talking historically about a certain place in time, time stamped and during these individual years. Also, during this interview, you will hear about Michael Thompson, former Aryan Brotherhood member. We individually at LA Times tried to reach out to Michael Thompson through email to ask for an interview. No response was given. We even offered to pay Michael monetarily. The reason we reached out to Michael first was to first give him the chance to explain himself, what seems like inconsistencies in his story regarding beating up 7 Nuestra Familia members inside Tracy prison. So, being that he did not reply, we are not a channel that exposes people. But in this conversation, it did come up with John Silva since he was a worker at Tracy. So we touch on that question also. We encourage you to hear the whole interview. It's over an hour long. You're going to hear nuggets on different things. Like I said, from Crips to Bloods, North to South, female COs, stabbings, whatever you would have it. You're going to hear about Greg Powell, the Onion Field killer. You're also going to hear about Mitch Smiley. You're going to hear smuggling food. You're going to hear everything. So I asked all the questions that I could think of, all the way down to even the KILROY movie. What were his thoughts on it as a former correctional officer? So anyways, without further ado, we hope that you enjoy this interview with a well-respected correctional officer from DVI Tracy, formerly. His name is John Silva.
So my name is John Silva, and I was a former correctional officer for California Department of Corrections at DVI in Tracy. So I grew up just 10 minutes from DVI in Tracy, California. I was born there, I was raised there, attended school there, and well, obviously my good influence were my parents. I was fortunate to have both parents growing up, and so that was the positive influence. The friends and people in the town. When I grew up there, it was fairly small, about 15,000 people. So I was able to interact with different people from all walks. So it was really beneficial to grow up in an environment like that. And as far as bad, you know, I think that we all we do the little things here and there when we're growing up. And in my case, I like to go fast. And as soon as I got my license, I had a motorcycle, and I like to go fast on the motorcycle. And as soon as I got a car, I like to go fast in the car. And I never had any DUIs or any accidents, but I was very popular with the local police department to the point where I had my license pulled more than once, just for my driving habits. And by the time I was 18, I got to go to the county jail, San Joaquin County. And as far as where that ended was when I was 18. The second time I had to go before the judge for driving on a suspended license, he wanted to give me 6 months in a county jail. So I went from basically doing weekends to doing 6 months. And as soon as he mentioned the 6 months, I asked him, well, is there anything else that we could do? Because I really didn't want to go to the jail for 6 months. And I suggested that I go into the military. So with that, the judge gave me 2 weeks to either come back with my enlistment papers or to be ready to go do my 6 months. So I hustled myself to the recruiter over in Stockton, and I got myself enlisted. and came back 2 weeks later with my enlistment papers and went off to the military. So as far as ethnic mixture, racial mixture, that's one of the beauties of growing up in Tracy, is that we had everybody. We had whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and the neat thing about it is we only had one high school. So whether you lived in town or whether you lived in the country, whether you lived in the best neighborhood or whether you lived in the projects, we all ended up going to the same high school. So you became familiar with and interacted with all these kids of different walks. And the neat thing about it was there were no issues. You know, one kid didn't act better because he lived in this neighborhood, and we didn't really know that just because a kid maybe lived in the quote projects, we didn't really understand what projects were, so we didn't really trip on it, you know. So, but we all got along, and like I said, I think it was a blessing that I was able to grow up with all the different races, because it's made it to where even to this day I have friends of all races. You asked about gangs. There was somewhat of a presence of Northern Hispanic gangs in Tracy. South Side Tracy, there was that was an area that did have somewhat of a gang influence. Nothing like it is nowadays, of course. The town was 15,000 people. Now it's 100,000 people. But it's still pretty chill in Tracy as far as we don't have drive-bys like some of these bigger cities do. It's still a pretty chill place to live. But like I said, we did a small gang influence. I know a few friends of mine that were in the Northern Hispanic gangs growing up and as adults. But again, it not nearly as bad as it could be in some of the bigger cities where there's a lot larger population. So I went into the Air Force, and that was on a recommendation of my father. My father had been career Army. And so when myself and a few of my friends, we went off to join the Marine Corps, because we were full of all that stuff that you're full of when you're 18 years old, and we wanted to be rough, tough Marines. And my dad had told me that if he had to do it over again, that he would do it in the Air Force. And when I asked why, he says, well, basically because they have the best housing, the best food, and they don't have an infantry. So basically, if you can't do anything else, they're not going to hand you a rifle and tell you to go stand point. So with that, and the fact that the Air Force was the one that was able to get me enlisted first, because I only had a 2-week window, I went with the Air Force. And so that's why I ended up going there. Now, one of my buddies, who I'll later talk about in this story, he ended up going in the Marine Corps at the same time. We both just went in different directions. But boot camp is boot camp. I'm not going to try and say that the Air Force boot camp is as difficult as Marine Corps boot camp, because back in the mid 70s, it simply wasn't. But it was still boot camp, and they still played mind games on you, and they still deprived you of sleep. And I remember about my third day laying in the rack in our squadron, laying there looking at the ceiling, thinking, what did I get myself into? You know, because again, you're 18 years old, and you got these adults that are playing mind games on you. But what we found out is about after 3 weeks, everybody started coming together as one, and the camaraderie, we all needed each other to survive. And we clicked, and it worked. And what it did is it squared me away in a sense that it's difficult to explain, but being in boot camp squared away the stuff that I wasn't squared away with when I was at home. And so from then on through the rest of my adult life, I think that played a major role. The rest of my military aside, definitely boot camp was the eye opener. So the thought of becoming a correctional officer pretty much never crossed my mind. Growing up, again, because I didn't have a real positive relationship with law enforcement, and I had been in the county jail, I didn't really have any desire to work nor go to prison. But because I had gotten myself squared away while I was in the military, going to jail or going to prison to me wasn't going to happen. I pretty much thought I had my stuff together. So I got my Class A license because I always liked driving things, and I liked driving cars, and I liked anything that I could drive. And so I thought, well, trucks is another thing to drive. So I got my Class A license, and I've been driving truck for a couple of years. And the friend of mine that I had grown up with that had gone in the Marine Corps, he got out of the Marine Corps and went to work out at Tracy at DVI. And we were having a conversation one day, and he asked me about going to work out there. And of course, my immediate response was, I don't have any desire to work at a prison. And he says, well, it's not really as difficult as you might think it is. And the thing that he told me that stays with me to this day is he said, if I can do it, I know you could do it. So with that, I put in an application. Now, back in the day, you actually went to the prison that you wanted to go to work at, and you actually went into their personal office. You got an application, you filled it out, just like going to any type of mom and pop place that you would go to apply for a job nowadays. You actually just went in there and you applied, and you filled out the application. They did the background check, you did your oral interview, all of that stuff was done in-house. And so I did that as a courtesy to him. And the next thing you know, I get a phone call, and I had to make a decision, drive truck the rest of my life or take a risk on going to work at the prison. And I didn't really want to drive truck. I didn't want to be 60 years old still driving a truck. So I took the gamble and went to work at the Department of Corrections. So what we did is you do 1 week orientation. So you spend your first week at the prison in the in-service training area, and they go over certain things that you're going to need to know before you actually go to the academy. So after the 1 week of orientation, then we did 6 weeks at the academy. And what they teach you at the academy is basically how to function in a correctional environment. As far as the history of the Department of Corrections, and then certain things about self-defense, about how to restrain somebody, how not to restrain somebody, how to apply restraint gear, all the things that you're going to need to know once you come into the prison. So that was 6 weeks, and it's physical conditioning. You're doing PT every day, physical training every day also, to make sure that the people that aren't in shape are physically able to handle running down the corridors, tackling somebody if you have to, being able to physically restrain somebody if you have to, basically doing the things that you would need to do to function in the correctional environment. So the first day, this is a funny thing. So I get out of the academy, and I've got my uniform. Now I'm an official correctional officer or prison guard, whichever way you want to call it. And I'm driving into work. And those are people that anyone that's ever been to Tracy, they know that when you first come in the road there's a long entry road, and there's the fences and the guard towers. And I remember driving in and looking over at the guard towers and looking at the cell blocks and asking myself, do I really want to do this? I mean, I just came through 6 weeks of an academy where I'm taught everything about what I need to be as being a correctional officer, but just the intimidation factor of driving in and seeing the razor wire, seeing the guard towers, seeing the cell blocks, and just thinking to myself, man, do I really want to do this? But then I told myself, I didn't really want to drive truck for the rest of my life either. So let's give it a shot. So I did. And that was my first day. You know, you accept the reality, but if you let fear play in, you're not going to be effective. You know, that old fight or flight thing. We actually had officers that when there was an incident, they actually ran the other way. And you can't go in there like that. You know, it's just like, to compare, you know, like if you're in a gang and all of a sudden things jump off, you can't think about fear. You know, you think about, you got to jump in, you got to do what you got to do. And so it was kind of the same thing, was that, you know, in the back of your mind, the potential is always there. You know, have people been killed in prison? Yes, they have. But what's the numbers? You know, what's the number of people that have been in prison, whether they've been in custody or whether they have been staff? What's the number that have actually been killed? Like when I started at Tracy, there'd only been 2 deaths since 1953. Well, I started in 1984. If only two guards had been killed in that many years, the chances of me getting killed there, were pretty slim. So with that in mind, I knew there was a potential you could get stabbed. Stabbings were very common back in the mid 80s. So, that's where the respect factor came in. I think respect was a bigger issue than fear. If you respected people, they respected you. In fact, after a short amount of time working at the prison, I actually had to readjust outside the prison, because people that had killed people would respect me inside the prison environment. Yet I'd go into a store and some teenage kid would cut in front of me in line, and I'd want to grab him by the back of the neck thinking, who are you? Who are you? I got killers that give me respect, and you're just some kid that's like trying to squeeze in front of me in line. So then I had to kind of check myself and tell me, man, this is just a kid. A kid doesn't know better yet. But the respect level, that was one of the things that I really, really liked, if you will, about prison, is it was no nonsense. You could have a sense of humor, but you knew where the line was. You didn't say thing about people, certain personal things that you would front them off. Because if you fronted somebody off, they don't have anywhere to go. They're going to have to deal with it. And if you disrespect somebody, they're going to deal with you. So treat people like you want to be treated. And that's how I always was. And you kind of loosen up over time. You kind of know who you can kind of joke around with, and you know who you never joke around with. And so you kind of take each personality on an individual basis, and then you just get to know those individuals, and then you function on a day-to-day basis with those personalities that way. So to answer that question about how I felt dealing with female correctional officers as my backup, it kind of gets back to that old story about it's not the size of the man in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the man. And as we both know, and I'm sure you've seen, sometimes the guy that's the smaller guy that you think is going to not have a chance in this fight ends up lighting up the person who's bigger than them because they have more fight in them. And so that's how it was. There were female officers that I worked with that to this day I still have respect for, because they would jump in with both feet with the men. And again, there were men that wouldn't jump in. So it was kind of, it's just individual basis. Sure, there were some females, I'm not going to say there weren't some females that in my opinion had no business being in that job, but you know what? There were some males that in my opinion had no business being in that job. Actually, by 84, it was pretty much a Southern prison. Yeah. Because of the stronghold, if you will, I guess that the Northern Hispanics had on Tracy at one time, they eventually shipped them all out. And it basically, when I got there, it was a Southern line. In fact, the majority of the black inmates that we had there were actually from down south also. And when I started there, they used to let them have their bandanas. And it was really, we liked it. As staff, we liked it because you knew who the players were just by what rags they had, right? And so there, there was a lot of blue rags on the line. You didn't I don't think there were any red rags at that time. It's just the way that it was. You had different groups, like the bikers, there were some green rags, one particular club has a green rag. You'd have some that just had a brown rag because they were just Hispanic, but they weren't in a particular gang. And so there were these different bandanas that people had, but by and far, 1984, it was primarily a Southern line.
So I get there around 88, and on the yard there was only blue rags.
Yep.
The Northerners weren't allowed to wear red rags, and there was a good amount of them, but they weren't allowed to. And I remember, and it's good you brought up that question, that answer, because around 1990, all of a sudden you started to see a red hat, a red bandana. The Northerners started to say, hey, we're not going to be punk no more. We're going to start bringing that red bandana back. And what, in a CO's mind, what are you guys thinking watching all this?
There was a reintegration period. By the time I retired, we had people from up north, Hispanics from up north and Hispanics from down south. We had, the primary black groups that were there, or gangs, if you will, were the Crips and the Bloods, which again was your blue rags and your red rags. And again, by the time I retired, we had both aspects on the line. I think it just took time to get them reintegrated to where you had people from different parts of the state at the same prison, but it did take time, and there's a transition process, when you're like the first bus, the first bus of guys from up north that are getting put on the line at DVI, it's a little transition. And the same thing as the first groups of Bloods, when it's primarily a Crip line, there's that transition period, where you got to come in and hold your own and until things are established.
They took away all the colors.
Right.
Remember that? What was the decision behind that?
So, and I don't know. Again, this came from the higher ups, and like I said, myself and the other custody, we liked it because we knew who was who. Once you took away the bandanas or the rags, however you want to call it, then what you had was everybody was the same. So it was more work on us. Like, for example, if there was a situation on the yard and they were allowed to have the bandanas, well, you knew who you took off the yard in what group, because you knew these guys were from this group and these guys were from that group. But once you took away the bandanas or the rags, whichever you want to call them, everybody's the same. So now you're having to try to figure out, and maybe you got a sleeper, right? Maybe you got a guy, say, for example, there's an issue, say there's a situation between like a northern and southern faction. And one guy, he's the torpedo. So they say, where are you from? And let's say that he's from up north, but he says, oh, I'm from down south. Okay, so they haul him off with the southern guys, and then he wants to try to make another move, right? Because he's the torpedo. So it was a lot easier. It was a lot easier when they allowed him to do that. And again, I don't know why. I don't know why administration at some point they decided to take that away, because to us it was easier to identify people that way.
The reason I bring it up, because people say this never happened. So about 88 here, Tracy was a level 3. They had a lot of level 4s there because they were lifers. They brought them for vocational and all that stuff. And then when all this red and blue started coming back on the yard, the Northerners and the Southerners decided to play a football game that turned into a riot. Probably around 1990 or so. Do you remember hearing about that, or were you on the yard when that happened? When you had to gaffle everybody up?
So that took place, I believe, on a weekend, because that's when they usually had the football games. And at that point, I wasn't working weekends. I think I was working R&R at that time, and we had weekends off. And so I remember hearing about it, but as far as the details, because I actually wasn't working the yard, I do know that there was a point where there were no more football games, so yeah. I think that had a definite effect on why there were no more football games. A lot of people don't know this, but they actually used to let the convicts play football on the grounds, on the field there at Tracy, and they actually had uniforms and everything that they got to wear. I mean, they played full contact tackle football.
So one thing that was interesting about Tracy is when you went to the hole, after 10 days, they would give you a TV. Did you ever work in that area of the hole, or?
I did work K-Wing. I did work K-Wing some. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever have to work the gun towers or anything like that?
Like I said, I was there just under 24 years, so there's probably wasn't a position I didn't work. And K-Wing was unique in its own way. The gun towers, I didn't really care for the gun towers, and the main reason was, to me, it was boring. There's nothing I liked less than having to just sit for 8 hours. So throughout my career, I never bid on a gun tower. I never requested a gun tower. The only times I worked gun towers is if I was like on sick leave relief or something like that, where someone called in sick and I had to work a gun tower. But I much preferred to be on the ground. In fact, one of the things that I prided myself with is that when certain people got got certain amount of years in their career, they didn't want to deal with the main line anymore, and so they would bid on the jobs up in the towers just so they wouldn't have to deal with anybody. And with me, it wasn't that way. I wanted to stay on the ground. I wanted to be on the main line and retire from the main line.
I always remember the gun towers being fair. I remember during the riot at the football game when they shot at us. Luckily, they didn't shoot at us.
Yeah.
Whoever up there made the decision to do warning shots, and thank God, because on the prison walls, no warning shots.
Right.
So I remember particularly, I'm going to throw some stuff at you, and don't worry if you don't remember none of this.
Sure.
One particular time, speaking of the guard tower, there was a white dude in the middle of the day tried to escape over the fence during the during full yard, during full yard daytime. Guard tower let him get over, and then boom, shot him right in the butt.
Yep.
I don't know. Do you remember that?
Absolutely, I remember that. I believe it was between Tower 5 and Tower 6, and what happened was this particular inmate. I think he was trying to get away from something. I don't really know the details, but I do remember the incident. And the reason with that was that the way that we were taught, talking about the fence. So there's two fences. There's the inner perimeter fence and the outer perimeter fence. And the rule that we had was the inner perimeter fence, you don't shoot them when they hit the inner perimeter fence. And the reason being is that somebody might be trying to kill them and they're trying to get away and they're just trying to escape with their life. So they're allowed to go over the first fence and into that area between the two fences. But once they hit the second fence, they're fair game, because then you have to assume they're trying to escape. And that's what happened in this case. He jumped the first fence. As soon as he hit that second fence, yeah, it was a female, as a matter of fact. See, female shot him, hit him in the buttocks.
What was funny about that, if I remember correctly, they shot him, they got him, they wheeled him out, and I think they let guard keep going.
Probably.
I think so. It wasn't like, it wasn't like they didn't lock us all down. I think.
Yeah.
Let me bring up another incident, if you remember this. I think in the vocational area, I believe they had, did they have auto upholstery?
Yes.
And you guys used to be able to bring your cars in to get worked on.
Yes.
But one time they found a bullet inside one of the one of the CO's thing. It was by chance, because I know you guys got to clean it before you bring it in. I don't know if you remember them finding a bullet. And
there were a couple times. Part of the risk of bringing a vehicle in, not just like for upholstery, you might be just bringing the seats in out of your car, but they also had auto body. They also had auto machine. And I myself, I've taken in a few cars over my career that I actually had work done on. So you can search your personal car to a degree, but unless you're literally pulling the carpet out and you're pulling the seats out, and let's say that if you're not the original owner of that car, and somebody that had that car before you, maybe they used to go out shooting a pistol or whatever, there's a possibility that a round could have fallen underneath the carpet or something, of course. And they do get searched. When the vehicles come through the sally port, they get searched. But again, to find every little thing. But yes, I do remember the time when they found a bullet in I think it was upholstery or somewhere.
The onion field killer. You remember Greg Powell?
Sure.
You remember him? What do you think of him, man? He's passed away now, right?
Well, as old as he would be now, I'm sure if he would be very old if he was, because he was pretty old when he was at Tracy.
Yeah.
Greg Powell, obviously he's one of those unique individuals that, he wasn't the only person at Tracy that had been convicted of a murder, but because they made a movie about him, the Onion Field Killer, he had a little more notoriety. But as far as someone doing time, Greg just did his time. He didn't play off of that. In fact, I'm sure he probably didn't even appreciate the fact that the movie was made, because probably didn't help him when he went to the parole board. But Greg, what he spent most of his time doing, and this is what I remember about Greg, and you may remember as well, playing tennis. That guy, and yes, for those that didn't know, not only did we have football field at Tracy and a swimming pool, we also had tennis courts and handball courts. But Greg that was his program. All he did was he'd go out and he'd play tennis.
Yeah, I remember Greg telling me, man, that every time he went up for parole, that they would play the movie.
Yeah.
Whether it was on purpose or not, man, he would get mad. I think he was in with me and Smiley and D-Wing for a while. So, let's talk somebody really quick, a mutual friend of ours. Mitch Smiley, man.
Yeah,
How was it meeting Mitch? And let me tell you, before I go into this, I had met Mitch because he was my next door cellie. He had a reputation for being a great tattooist, but he was smart. He didn't have like all these other guys running people in and out of his cell. He was careful who he tattooed on. He was very smart. I respect Mitch because I wish I did time the way he did. He had used the COs to his advantage, like it was his home. I was one of those more hiding from the COs because I was doing scandalous stuff. Where Smiley was just mostly about, I'm going to make money, tattoo, stuff like that. So tell me about meeting Mitch and, man, our mutual friend.
So the day that I met Mitch Smiley was, I was working the steam line in one of the chow halls. And partway through the meal, one of my servers went behind me and I saw him go out and give some extra food to Mitch. It might have been a couple extra eggs or eggs and sausage or something like that. And because I couldn't leave the steam line at that moment because I have to monitor what's going on at the steam line, I left it alone. So once the meal was finished, I walked out to Mitch and he was still sitting at the table. And I just walked up to him and asked him what his name was. And he told me his name was Smiley. And of course, as we all know, Smiley's a common nickname for people. So I said, no, man, I don't want your nickname. What's your real name? And he says to me, that is my real name. And I says, let me see your ID. So he pulls out his ID and he hands me his ID and I look at it and sure enough, Smiley. And I just started laughing because I thought, who in the world has a name like Smiley? So then I just told him, I says, well, just so you know, those are my eggs that he gave you. Those are not his eggs. And those are from me, not from him. And he just looked at me and he said, right on. And then that was it. And then from that day on, Mitch and I just kind of had a mutual respect. And that was it. But, and then of course, for those that don't know, Mitch and I have reconnected since he got out. And like Paul says, he's out because he's smart. He's got his life together, and Mitch is doing well.
Yeah, Mitch is a good guy. Had a good reputation on the yard. Like I said, he introduced me to Metallica. Him and his cellmate Keith. He had multiple cellies during that time, but Keith is the one I remember. So good guy, man. And just wanted to touch on Mitch Smiley. So another thing I wanted to ask you. Recently, if you follow YouTube, mm-hmm. You follow all the interviews. Mm-hmm. This guy Mike Thompson came mm-hmm. out and he said he knocked out like 7 Nuestra Familias. Yeah. And I don't know one person that could beat up 7 armed person. Armed. Recently, Nick Diaz a couple of years ago from Stockton, UFC fighter, said he fought 3 dudes, and that guy's a killer. He fought 3 dudes, and they got the better of him. And he's like, you don't want to fight 3 dudes. So this guy's saying he fought 7 dudes, and he beat them. Do you know if there's any truth to that story, or if there's any truth to that? So, like Mitch, I saw the interview. I saw the original interview that Mike Thompson did on like Nat Geo or something like that. There was actually an interview that they did with him, and it had to do with the gang that he was in, and him dropping out of that gang. And when I saw the interview the second go around, where he's claiming all these things that he did, again, from my perspective, I questioned it because it just didn't quite seem real to me. So I reached out to Mitch and asked Mitch, and of course, I'm sure, Mitch had got asked that question more times than he wanted to. Do you know this guy? And is this stuff true? And I asked actually somebody that was at DVI at the time when he claimed that he took on these 7 Northerners that were sent to kill him. And from the reports that I got, it's false. That the lieutenant that he said that let him go out on the yard with the baseball bat to take on all these guys, that there was never a lieutenant there by that name.
And this is coming to me from somebody who was actually employed there at the time when this occurred. So, you know, the only thing I can say about Mike Thompson, and this is the same thing that Mitch says, you know, do I think he was capable of killing back then? Do I still think he's capable of killing now? I'm sure. Do I think that some of his stories are a little exaggerated? I think that also. But again, it's just my opinion, because I wasn't in that chapel the day that he says he took on 7 people. So I don't know that. But in my opinion, like so many other people have said, you know, if anybody sent 7 people after you with weapons, unless you're some kind of Superman, you know, you're not going to win. Yeah. So the first time that I was aware of someone being stabbed, and it was in Sea Wing, and going back to 1984, back in the 80s. Again, things were taken a lot more serious back then. You know, you had to respect, and you got respected, but you had to give respect. And this one particular incident where this inmate got stabbed to death, he got killed. It was in the showers, and it was in the Sea Wing showers, and it was a white inmate. And I don't really know the entire, because you're never going to know. You're never going to know the entire story. But whatever the situation was, someone felt that, you know, that he disrespected or whatever, and they killed him. But I just remembered he was in the shower, and then being brought out of the shower dead. And that was one of the things that used to occur on a common basis, was people would get assaulted in the showers. In fact, it was so common because you're very vulnerable when you're in the shower. You know, when someone's taking a shower, you're going to have soap in your eyes, or you're going to have shampoo in your hair. And, you know, you're going to be in there with, I don't remember how many shower heads they had, whether it was 4 or 5 shower heads, but you'd have X number of people in there at the same time. So if I'm in there and I want to stab somebody, it's the perfect environment, because I'm going to be clean. As soon as I make the hit, I get my underwear and I walk out of there. I'm clean. You know, there's no evidence. There's no bloody pants. There's no bloody shoes. And the victim is lying in the shower, and end of story. Plus, there's so much movement during showers. People are coming and going in the showers, because that's part of the evening program when people are allowed to take showers. But because of the frequency of people being assaulted in the showers nowadays, and before I retired, they ended up putting a gate on all the showers. And so they would only let so many people in. If, like I said, if there's 4 shower heads, they would only let 4 people in at a time and close the gate behind them. When those 4 people were finished, they let those 4 out, and the next 4 got in. That way, if there was a killing in the shower, you have 3 suspects. And so you pretty much eliminated the stabbings in the showers. But like I said, when I first started, it was very common. And vividly, I remember to this day, I also had to escort out someone who had taken their life one time. A young man that had gotten committed, and he just felt that it wasn't something that he didn't want to burden his family with him being in prison. And it was really sad, because he was only in his 20s, but it was in the reception center after we had become a reception center, and he had hung himself. And I remember escorting this man's body out. And, you know, you just think about, like, by now, his time would have been over with a long time ago. He would have gotten out, and he'd have resumed his life. But sometimes people, you know, they can't see tomorrow. You know, they can't see that there is a tomorrow, and they get caught up in just right now. And at that moment in his life, he just felt that it, you know, it wasn't worth living, that he didn't want to burden his family with him being in prison, and he took his life. And so it was really, really unique to have to sit there with somebody that had done that to themselves. You know, I never had a crime scene that I think we did, and then the orderlies did. You know, I think we did to a degree, and then the orderlies would come in with the mop buckets, you know, and finish. But once if it was a, you know, quote, crime scene, once the crime scene was taken care of, then I think that the orderlies would come in, especially if it was on the tier or something like that, because, you know, they would just be mopping it up.
Yeah. And I know I know you worked chow hall for a while. I worked for chow hall for a while, and for a while I worked in that center corridor where you'd come out of the chow hall, and there would be off at the time it was the late '80s, early '90s. There was Officer Nowak right there, and then that was the door to the yard right there on the other side. I was the guy who was running stuff out of the chow hall. You know, food. Everything, passing stuff to the yard. You know what I mean? Because Nowak was chill. Don't get me wrong, he didn't compromise at all. But he trusted us a little, and I was the guy running. So my question is this: how much did you guys, or maybe you individually, because I know it's individual, how much did you care about smuggling? Smuggling contraband.
So there's contraband, and then there's contraband. Contraband, obviously, if it's weapons and drugs, that's a no-no. That's a big no-no, because that's the stuff that gets people hurt. If you're talking about contraband, like somebody sneaking a cinnamon roll out of the kitchen because they work for you and they're a good worker, yeah. If someone said they never let their worker, once the meal is finished, if there's any extra food. Now, first there has to be extra food, but if there is no extra food, then it's not an issue. But let's say that I work in the chow hall and my worker does a good job, and it's, like I said, cinnamon roll day. And the cinnamon rolls are going to get one of two things. You let your workers have them, or they get thrown in the trash. Well, I'm not going to waste food. So if I have a good worker, comes to work every day, does a great job, and once we're all done and they're going to throw away this tray of cinnamon rolls, and they ask me, hey, can I have this cinnamon roll? Of course I'm going to let them have it. Now, technically, is that a violation? I guess, because they're only supposed to have their issue. They're only supposed to have their one cinnamon roll. But if a guy's my worker and he does a good job and the stuff is going to get thrown away anyway, do I have an issue with him taking home that cinnamon roll? No. Now, he's going to have to get to his cell with it, because as you know, there are other staff that could search his lunch bag or whatever on the way back to his cell that might find that extra cinnamon roll in there. But that's a risk that they'll take once they get out of the chow hall. But to say that I've never let one of my chow hall workers take back an extra cinnamon roll or something like that, no, it happens.
What's the craziest kind of stuff you found as weapons there?
As far as what I found as weapons, not a lot, because again, like you said, most of the time it's hidden. Sometimes it's in broad daylight. Kind of a funny story that I tell, and I won't give up the officer's name because he later promoted and did well with his career, but he was a rookie officer, and it was just about the end of my shift, and I happened to be walking the yard with him one day, and we were walking the track, and for whatever reason, someone had basically just thrown this piece on the ground. And when I walked up to it, I looked at it, and I knew what it was. It was a metal shank with a handle on it, but it was kind of a round shank and almost resembled like a corn dog. It almost had the resemblance of how a corn dog would look, only it was metal with the handle. So as we walked up to it, I kind of looked over at it, and I knew what it was, but it was getting close to our end of our shift. So I asked him, I go, hey man, what is that? Is that a corn dog? And he goes, I don't know. And I go, check it out. And then when he reached over to pick it up, he goes, hey, it's a shank. And I go, man, good find. So then he got to stay after and do the write-up on it, finding this piece on the yard. But there weren't too many times. There was another time when I found something on the yard. I would have to say by and far that you guys were better at hiding it than we were at finding it, because that was your job. If you needed it and I could find it, what good was it going to do you, right? So I know that people were better at hiding things than we were, and certainly myself. There were officers that could sniff out a weapon. I remember this one officer that used to work on the squad, and the guy was like a bloodhound, man. He would walk into a housing unit and come out with a shank, and I'd look, I thought, man, I want to be like him. And I'd look and I'd search behind the heaters, and I'd search under the windowsills, and I'd search, and I'd never find anything. And I'm like, man, how's this guy finding all this stuff? But There was only a couple times that I ever found anything. I did catch my guys in Night Industries one time trying to sneak metal out of Night Industries. And the way they were doing it, and they were pretty crafty, but what busted them was their greed. They would bring in bread and lunch meat and cheese and whatnot to feed the inmates at night in the Night Industries, and they would come in on those rollaway carts. Well, what they would do is they would have excess left over, and they would send it back to the kitchen. And so what they would do is they would have excess bread left over. And so the guys, and I wasn't searching it because it still looked like a whole loaf of bread, they were putting metal inside the bread. Well, this particular time, they put the metal in there and they didn't separate it. So when I grabbed the loaf of bread and it kind of went cha-ching, and I went, hey, bread doesn't do that. So then I opened up the loaf of bread and I thought, you little, you know what?
Yeah.
You guys are trying to sneak metal out of here. So, again, you learn things as you go. But on that, up to that point, I don't know how much metal they were sneaking out of Night Industries in the food cart. But at that point, I realized they could sneak food out of Night Industries in the food cart. So then at least at that point on, the bread got searched.
Yeah.
You mean as far as like the
CO
ink?
smuggling?
Well,
COs.
obviously, if you brought in anything that was considered contraband, I mean, it's a violation of employment. Yeah. I mean, whether you're bringing in something as petty as a vial of India ink, or whether you're bringing in cell phones, or whether you're bringing in drugs, obviously those are things that would get you fired. I mean, because it's a violation. Like you mentioned about tattoos and people bringing in ink. I mean, I never had anyone ask me to bring in ink. I knew that most of the peoples that tattooed that wanted to use ink, it was real simple. You ordered calligraphy stuff through the hobby. With ordering calligraphy, you need ink. So they would always know who, so many guys that didn't do calligraphy had calligraphy pens and they had calligraphy ink. So that's where they were getting their India ink, was through the hobby program. Those that didn't have that, of course, they would resort to, like even Mitch said, using ashes. They would burn something to create ashes. So I never really knew until you mentioned about somebody bringing in ink, because it was too accessible. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like drugs or cell phones. Yeah, I mean, you could order ink. So I was kind of surprised that anybody would ask for somebody. Now, I did have somebody offer to me. I had a tattoo pattern drawn up by one of the lifers, and I bought it through the hobby, and paid him for his work. But I did have somebody that worked for me in the culinary that was very well known at doing tattoos. And he worked in the bakery, and he offered to do that for me. He goes, hey, if you want me to put that on you, he says, once we're done with the bakery, he says, we can go in the supply room and I'll put that on you. And I respectfully declined, only because, the old thing about people brag or people talk. And if it came back around and someday somebody asked me, hey, did you get a tattoo done on you by so-and-so? And I said, no. And they said, well, roll up your sleeve. Let me see what you got on you. Because how are you going to deny it? You got something tattooed on you. I mean, they would have to prove that he did it, and I would have to prove that he didn't. But just for the sake of not doing something like that, like I said, I said, hey man, I really appreciate you offering, but no, I don't think I'm gonna get this done here. Myself and like I've discussed previously, is that you treat people how you would want to be treated. My mentality was I really didn't care what the person was in prison for. I didn't look down on one person any more than the other. In fact, one time, and I think I told Mitch this, that one guy was trying to downplay another inmate that was doing time because his crime was lesser than what his particular crime was. And I told him, I said, well, make no mistake, if any of you had committed your crime against me or one of my families, regardless of what it was, I wouldn't like you very much, because to me, a felony is a felony, regardless of what level. But as why I don't think people necessarily hated on me, and I don't. Again, I'm sure there's people who didn't like me. You know, there's people that just have a problem with authority in general. And, you know, whether it's your mom and dad and you're growing up, your school teacher, or it's the local police officer, some people just have a problem with authority. But by and far, I embraced the respect. And that's why I think I got along and interacted not only with the inmates, but also with staff. I got along with my peers as well as I got along with the staff. In fact, one time I took a friend of mine out there on a tour. And when we walked through the main line, and I was greeted by staff and the inmates as well. And after we were finished with the tour, he made a comment to me. He says, you know, I really expected the staff to interact with you that way, but I never thought that the convicts would be like that. And I said, well, it's just you treat them like you want to be treated. And I think that's in life in general. You don't have to be doing time, or you don't have to be working at a prison to be able to respect people. If you treat people like you would want to be treated, most of the time people will treat you the same way. But it's easier to disrespect than it is to respect, but you get a lot better results if you respect people. And I think that's why it was so beneficial for me, or why I interacted so well. And it's, kind of, sometimes I look back, being in corrections was never a career I pursued. It's just something that I ended up doing. And as a saying, we all have a gift, and God has a purpose for all of us. And we all have a place that we're going to fit in. And in my case, I guess that was just the gift that was given to me, that I was going to be able to function and interact in that environment, so that these people could do their time, and so that my coworkers could do their job, and so that we could work together and it become positive. Because, like I said, if I would have thought to myself growing up I was going to be working in a correctional facility, I would have told you no way. But it's just the path that God sent me on, and it was a blessing in disguise, because I was fortunate. I was able to retire young. I retired at 50. Very few people can retire at 50 with a pension, with benefits. And it was all because of the blessing that someone who is also a Christian now, that talked me in to taking a job with corrections, and the rest is history. To answer, did I ever see people on the street that I had seen in the facility? Yes. As a matter of fact, one individual that grew up here in Tracy that I still see on a regular basis. In fact, it's kind of funny. He's out. He hasn't been back in the prison system for years. And one of the things I started doing after I retired was maintaining bicycles. I became very good at it, and it worked out really well for me. Again, another gift, something I had no intentions of doing, and for some reason God made me good at working on bikes, and I did really well at it. And to this day, I still do this for people. Well, this individual, he rides his bike a lot. And to this day, a guy that I grew up with, ended up in prison, ended up out of prison. We still interact all the time. And it's kind of funny. To this day, he still thanks me for giving him a job when he was there. And it's just like, well, it was a trade-off. I gave him a job. He did good for me. But I do see people, there are people I grew up with, friends of mine that I grew up with that ended up, unfortunately in prison, that have gotten out, and nothing changed. Nothing changed. I mean, we're still the friends that we were before, and to this day we're still friends. So I don't hold it against them, and they don't hold it against me, because again, we always had the same love and affection for each other, regardless of what side we were on.
Yeah, we have another mutual friend, David Rocha, Sir Dino. How did you meet him, and what did you know about? How did you guys become friends?
So David, through my bicycle business. David came to me when he first got into cycling. David was overweight, and he was trying to lose weight, and he had bought a bicycle, and he was needing some work done on it. And so he came to me, and I would work on his bike for him. And sometimes I would do it for him just as a courtesy. And we got to know each other and found out that we both grew up in the same town, and kind of knew some of the same people. And in fact, we were both kind of fascinated, or I don't want to say shocked, but we were both kind of fascinated when I found out that he had done time, and he found out that I had worked in a prison facility. So it's just kind of funny how the circle, it made a full 360. It's like, here we are, we both grew up in the same town. We both ended up for different reasons in the prison environment. And then here we are today, and, and both of us are living our lives. But that's how I met David initially, was he needed some work done on his bicycle, and I helped him out.
Yeah, I don't even know if you know the scope of that guy, who he is and what he is, and he's considered like the godfather of rap for Northern California,
I didn't know that either. Yeah, as time went on, and then I heard about it before he told me about it, because at first, when I first met David, I think he was trying to leave that chapter closed, because that's what got him into prison. And so he wanted to leave that chapter closed, because once he became a Christian and a pastor, I don't think he really wanted to dwell on the fact that he'd been in prison and that he was a rapper, and that he was kind of caught up in the negative. But I think what's happened is he's realized that none of us are perfect, and that we all have a past. And by sharing his story with people, that he could have a negative past and turn it into a positive, he was willing to open up. But yeah, I never knew that he had been a rapper prior to ending up in prison, prior to ending up being a pastor.
Yeah.
So as far as my retirement, so the minimum age to retire in corrections at that time was 50. So as I approached 50, when I had my 50th birthday, I thought, okay, I have this relief that now they can't threaten me with firing me if I make a mistake. I'll just turn in my paperwork and retire. So I had this kind of relief. Not that I had ever done anything that would have jeopardized my career, but it's always in the back of your mind that if you make a mistake, whether your fault or not, you could get fired. There were people that I worked with that really wasn't an intentional thing they did, but they made a mistake and they got fired for it. So up until you're of the minimum age, you always know that you may not make it to retirement. You may get fired. So when I turned 50, I thought, okay, now I'm on cruise control. I can just work however many more years I want to work, and then retire when I want to. And the maximum number of years is 30 years for full retirement. Well, I had 24 years in, so I still had some more to go if I wanted my maximum retirement. But it was about 3 months later, after I had turned 50, I was looking out. I was working in the laundry, and I was looking out on the dock, and it was a spring morning, and I just thought to myself, I'd really rather be doing something else right now than being here. And that's all it took. And so I turned in my paperwork, and 3 months later I was retired. But it was just because, not because that I was stressed out over the job, or not because I was sick of the job, but it was because I was in enough of a position that I didn't need to chase every single dollar that I had to make in order to retire. I went out at 72%, which was comfortable enough. And that was it. And I did stay on. The first year I stayed on as what they call an annuitant. And basically what it is you're a contract employee that you work on a day-by-day basis, so that if someone calls in sick, instead of having to order someone overtime, they'll call you in, and they're just paying you a flat rate to come in. And so I did that for the first year to kind of fill in the gap between what I was making before I retired and what I was making after I retired. However, it didn't take very long before I realized it was still like going to work. And pretty much once I was done with going to work at the prison, I was done with working at the prison. And I'd already started working as a hobby on people's bicycles. And at that point is when I decided to make it a full-on business. And even though I never became a bicycle shop, as they call it, I did maintenance. As a mechanic, I worked on people's bikes, everything from just minor tune-ups to complete builds. And that filled in the gap. I became very popular with that, and that became my thing. But yeah, got to that point where I just one day said, I think I'd rather be doing something else. In closing, that, you know, for you youngsters, it's a long life. It's a long life. You don't have to become who you're going to be all at once. I know when we're young, we're trying to become somebody, and it's difficult. You know, I was rebellious. I was trying to make a name for myself when I was a young man, and the fact is that people are going to respect you if you're respectful. As far as, you know, give it time. It's a long life. It's going to go by in a blink of an eye, but believe me, I've been around 60 years, and every year is something new. You know, every year I learn something new. And just one last thing, I guess, that I could say, and you know, because you're a religious person and I'm a Christian, I read the Bible every day, is just that when you have problems in your life, you'd be surprised how much that the Bible and that God will help you if you let them. But we want to do it on our own. You know, I want to be my old man. I don't need God's help. I don't need this. And there's a reason why people like Paul, like David, even like KILROY, you know, God was a way for them to be able to have a full life and not have to keep living the life they were living before they found the Lord. And so, you know, it works for me. It works for me, and it can work for you, but accept him. You know, let Jesus into your life, and life will come to you. It will come to you. When you told me yesterday that, you know, that you're going to stop by today and interview me, and you mentioned the KILROY movie, I thought, well, last night I'll watch it. You know, I'll watch it so that if we do have a conversation about the movie, that I could have some feedback for you. And I was impressed. You know, the way that the movie was laid out, and I realize it's difficult, you know, in 90 minutes to tell an entire story, but there was enough of a story, and I'm not so sure if the determining factor for KILROY was when his friend Nico was killed, because he was a Christian already, and you know, the gang couldn't accept that he'd accepted the Lord, and so because of that, they took his life. And I know there was a lot of guilt. At least I felt there was a lot of guilt from KILROY. And I'm not sure if that wasn't the turning point in his life that made him decide to become a Christian and turn to the Lord. Whatever the reason was, it made the difference. And eventually KILROY became Christian. And the thing that really impressed me was at the very end of the movie, and you have to wait for it because it's after the credits. There's a few seconds of a clip, and it's KILROY himself. It's not the actor. And he makes a comment, you know, that nobody lives forever, but he knows where he's going. And that's the same way I feel.
Awesome, brother. We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, bro.